The sound of my own key turning in the lock was met by the silence of the grave, not the usual cacophony of a family finishing dinner. Michael stood there, blocking the hallway light, his face a mask of calculated inconvenience, like I had arrived unannounced at a business meeting. "Dad," he started, avoiding my eyes while adjusting his expensive wristwatch, "we need you to move out. Sarah and I are expanding the nursery, and frankly, we need the space." The breath caught in my throat wasn't just shock. It was the first tremor of an earthquake I had spent 4 decades building the foundation for. I looked from his polished leather shoes to the ceiling fan I had installed myself 15 years prior, trying to find the joke, the misplaced humor that would shatter this obscene moment. I didn't know then that being asked to leave was the cheapest price I would pay. The true cost of my devotion, the deep rot of the sacrifice that defined my existence, was still hidden beneath the surface of his cold, clinical gaze. I sensed an awful, deeper requirement, a fundamental shift in the earth below my feet that this house was merely the first casualty of. I am Arthur Miller, 65 years old, 5 years into a retirement I thought I had earned. For 40 years, the smell of sawdust, engine grease, and the cheap coffee from my thermos defined me. Every joint in my back, every persistent ache in my knee, was a receipt paid in full for this 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, for Michael's private college tuition, for the stability that allowed him to become the successful, detached man standing here demanding my removal. I lived a life of deliberate modesty, no fancy vacations, no expensive hobbies, rarely a new jacket, because my only ambition was permanence. I needed to know that when the work stopped, the shelter would remain. My world was small, simple, safe, and utterly dependent on the quiet, assumed loyalty that I mistook for bedrock. This house wasn't just wood and drywall, it was the only monument I ever built to myself, and until that precise moment I believed it was indestructible. The air immediately thickened around me, hardening into something brittle and opaque. The following morning, I walked into the kitchen, a space I had maintained religiously for 12 years, and found my usual chair pushed tightly against the wall, inaccessible. He did not look up from his coffee. The screen glare of his tablet caught his eyes perfectly, forming a brilliant, impenetrable barrier. I asked about the traditional Friday night dinner we hosted, a ritual spanning a decade, involving his sister and my colleague. His response was a dismissive flick of the wrist, stating that things were changing, and that social obligations needed to be postponed indefinitely. It wasn't the cancellation that stung. It was the clinical neutrality in his voice, the complete absence of apology or regret for dissolving a sacred, long-standing rhythm of our life. I was being edited out of the social calendar before I was even out of the house. Later that afternoon, retrieving my spare car key from the utility drawer, my fingers brushed against a folded, stiff piece of cardstock tucked beneath the stack of outdated maintenance receipts. It wasn't ours. It was a business card, thick and highly embossed, for a mid-tier suburban real estate agent I'd never heard of, specializing in rapid closings and discreet liquidations. The ink on the card looked disturbingly fresh, the corners sharp and uncreased. It was a detail so small it screamed volumes. This wasn't an unforeseen bureaucratic hiccup or a sudden change of heart. This was a calculated, premeditated exit strategy, and the very specific language on the card suggested urgency and secrecy. I was clearly not listed as a joint decision-maker, merely an obstacle requiring discreet liquidation. I placed the card back exactly where I found it, mimicking the accidental disorder. That evening, I attempted a conversation about the upcoming quarterly property taxes, a chore we always handled together, meticulously reviewing the budget. I framed it as a shared responsibility, a test to see if the illusion of a shared life still held water. He snapped immediately, his usual measured patience replaced by thin-lipped aggression. "I've handled it," he bit out, slamming a cupboard door shut with unnecessary force. "Don't worry about the finances anymore. They are under control." The shift from our finances to the finances was a subtle linguistic knife twist. It wasn't just a rejection of my help, it was the explicit walling off of the future, denying me access to the very ledger that defined my investment. I saw the lie forming behind his eyes, a carefully constructed facade of competence meant only to push me away from the details, away from the evidence. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unsaid accusations and undeniable truths. The house, my supposed sanctuary, transformed overnight into a maze of hostile zones. I couldn't sit in the living room without feeling his gaze on my back, cold and assessing, treating me like a security risk. I started eating my meals standing up next to the counter, avoiding the dining table where we once planned our modest future. I became a creature of habit and shadow, moving quietly through the hallways, documenting every small erasure of my existence. My favorite mug moved to the back shelf, my gardening gloves gone from the hook, the persistent, minor signs that someone was already editing me out of the narrative of this home. This wasn't merely a legal battle, it was psychological erosion, designed to make me feel small, disposable, and ultimately ready to leave quietly without a fight. The foundation I had trusted had not just cracked, it was actively being pulverized from the inside piece by piece by the one person I had trusted to protect it. The persistent, suffocating silence in the house was punctuated only by the aggressive, rapid-fire clicking of his keyboard coming from the converted home office, a space he now guarded like a fortress, sealing himself off from any unwanted interaction. He was operating in a parallel universe where I was already an inconvenient ghost. The emotional battleground had shifted from the physical rearrangement of domestic items to the deliberate erasure of our shared history, and I found the next piece of evidence lying face down beneath a pile of bills on the kitchen island. It was an envelope, thick, cream-colored, and smelling faintly of expensive jasmine. The formal script was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. James Hawthorne. My pulse tightened instantly. I recognized the elegant calligraphy of Sarah, our close friend, whose wedding we had been eagerly planning to attend for months. We were supposed to be sitting at the head table, but when I carefully slid out the inner card, the shock was cold and immediate. The seating arrangement specified only James Hawthorne and guest. The single word guest was a surgical strike. We had known Sarah and David since college. They were godparents to our youngest child. This was not a generic invitation error or a mistake by a rushed printer. This was a deliberate instruction from James to the hosts, a preemptive public declaration of my diminishing status. He wasn't just legally trying to dispose of me, he was socially introducing me to our shared world as an interchangeable placeholder, a temporary fixture until a more permanent replacement could be slotted into the seat. I didn't storm the fortress of his office. I knew the denial would be instant and smooth. It must be a simple mistake, darling, I'll call Sarah. The calculated casualness of his sabotage demanded a more calculated response. Instead, I sought tangible proof of malice, something that negated the possibility of clerical error. I moved to the messy junk drawer, where he carelessly tossed receipts and minor documents, and there, underneath a stack of dry cleaning tickets, I found the RSVP reply card, already filled out and mailed back 2 weeks prior. Next to the line confirming attendance, he hadn't simply checked the box for 2 guests. He had scrawled a small, almost microscopic note intended for Sarah, written in that tight, controlled handwriting I knew so well. Apologies for the confusion. The current situation is complex. Please just list me +1 for now. Thanks, Jay. The chilling efficiency of the request made the blood drain from my face. The current situation was me. He hadn't just accepted my exclusion. He had actively requested the obfuscation of my identity to our friends, turning the decade and a half of our marriage into a bureaucratic complication he managed with chilling, polite correspondence. That note, small and seemingly innocuous, was the true first plot point, the confirmation that this was a campaign of erasure, not a mere consequence of a failing marriage. He was laying groundwork, ensuring that when the final move happened, the world would already be conditioned to see me as expendable, a footnote in his life story. The discovery shifted the fear from merely losing the house to the terrifying prospect of losing my entire established reality, piece by agonizing piece. I stood there, holding the RSVP card like a confession, the silence of the house suddenly roaring with the sound of my own internal collapse. I realized then that I wasn't fighting a partner anymore. I was fighting an operative. The RSVP card had confirmed my fears, but it hadn't prepared me for the performance that followed. Elias, the man I now viewed solely as an operative, maintained his routine with terrifying precision. He asked about my day, signed the mortgage papers, the irony was a sharp physical pain, and discussed our upcoming travel plans, all while knowing he was systematically dismantling the ground beneath my feet. I learned to watch him not as a wife, but as an intelligence analyst watching an enemy agent. Every gesture was scrutinized, the slight tightening around his eyes when I mentioned a specific shared memory, the overly warm hand on my shoulder, all calculated movements designed to maintain the equilibrium until the detonation. I said less and less, my responses becoming clipped and factual, fearing that any genuine emotion would be misinterpreted as weakness or worse, a premature declaration of war. The atmosphere in the house curdled from tense silence into an active, corrosive Cold War. We inhabited the same space, but ceased to share air. The unspoken pact was that we would continue to function publicly, but privately, we had severed all connection. The most damning indicator of this severance came not from a fight, but from a quiet shift in our sleeping arrangement. Citing stressful deadlines and needing uninterrupted rest, Elias moved into the guest suite, claiming he wanted to avoid waking me. This was the promised silence manifesting physically, a clinical, justifiable distance that eliminated the risk of intimacy, and more importantly, eliminated the risk of him accidentally revealing something in the vulnerable hours of the night. He had built a fortress around his operation, and I was now locked outside its walls, staring in. The first public, undeniable affront hit like a slap during dinner prep the following week. It was the thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the prestigious seal of the Harrington Foundation Gala, an event we had co-chaired for 5 years. I picked it up from the mahogany console, expecting the usual formality, but the address window stopped my breath. It read simply, Mr. Elias Thorne. The customary and Mrs. was absent. The Mr. and Mrs. Elias Thorne that had always guaranteed our joint presence, confirming our partnership in social and philanthropic circles, was gone. It was such a small omission, a single punctuation mark and 2 words, yet it screamed of systematic exclusion. My name hadn't been forgotten, it had been surgically removed. When Elias came into the kitchen whistling a tune, I suddenly found grating. I held the invitation loosely, letting him see the address pane. He didn't flinch. His reaction was too quick, too smooth, lacking any genuine surprise. "Ah, that," he said, reaching for the envelope with a rehearsed casualness. "I noticed that earlier. Must be the new database they installed. Apparently they are streamlining all correspondence to the primary donor. I meant to call the foundation office today to update it, but the market was chaotic." He dismissed the missing misses as a clerical error, a glitch in the system. But I watched his eyes. They didn't flicker with embarrassment or inconvenience. They held the dull, steady light of a man successfully deploying a rehearsed contingency plan. He wasn't apologizing for a mistake. He was justifying an action. His composure gave me the clarity I needed. I couldn't afford hysterics. I needed data. That night, after ensuring the guest suite door was closed and the house settled into its deep, deceptive quiet, I began the meticulous search. The RSVP card had confirmed the intent. The exclusion from the gala confirmed the public execution. Now I needed the legal evidence. I started where the money was. His home office, specifically the reinforced filing cabinet, he always claimed held sensitive client documents, but kept locked even when he wasn't home. I knew his current safe combination. It was an antiquated habit he never changed. I slipped inside the chilled, sterile space, the scent of expensive leather and polished wood assaulting my senses. My fingers, trembling only slightly, navigated the heavy lock. I didn't look for bank statements. Those were too generalized. I looked for something specific, something that proved he was actively rerouting our shared life. Buried beneath a stack of dated stock. Prospectuses, I found it. A single, crisp receipt from a secure storage facility downtown. the kind that housed high-value assets and required biometric access. The date on the receipt was 2 weeks old, exactly when the discussion about streamlining our investment portfolio had begun. It wasn't the rental agreement itself that was the shock, but the attached printed memo, quickly typed and initialed in the corner. Contents transferred from Joint Holding to Safe Deposit Box 441B, access restricted to ET only. The air left my lungs entirely. This wasn't a clerical error or a communication mix-up. This was theft, executed with calculated foresight. He hadn't just removed my name from a social invitation. He was actively liquidating and securing assets in a private vault, effectively draining the reservoir while I was still blissfully unaware, drinking from the tap. Safe deposit. Box 441B. That number felt like a jail cell designation, a final isolated place where my financial security was being held hostage. The terror was no longer a theoretical fear of potential homelessness. It was the concrete realization that half of everything we had built was already gone, spirited away to a location I couldn't access, protected by locks I couldn't pick, held by a man who was no longer my husband, but a highly efficient thief, residing in my home. I folded the receipt, the paper sharp against my palm, and retreated, the scent of expensive leather now smelling exactly like rot. The operative had made his first major move, and I now held the proof of his financial casualty extraction. The fight had officially moved from the emotional battlefield to the legal minefield. I was no longer fighting for our marriage, I was fighting for my survival. The silence that descended upon the house was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum, thick with unsaid accusations and meticulously calculated next steps. We moved through the vast cold rooms like two predator species who had mutually agreed to suspend open hostilities, prioritizing reconnaissance. The receipt, now sealed in a discreet envelope and hidden behind a loose floorboard in my dressing room, was my silent weapon. I no longer saw my husband. I saw the operative who had infiltrated my life, and my every movement became counter-surveillance. I slept in the guest wing, claiming the disruption of his late-night calls was interfering with my work. He accepted this with a patronizing nod, perhaps believing the distance was a sign of my emotional withdrawal rather than strategic retreat. The first month of this undeclared war was dedicated to pattern recognition. I started tracking his business, trips, those 3-day disappearances to supposed conferences in cities that never seemed to require a time zone change. I cross-referenced these dates with the activity reports of our joint portfolio, which I had secretly accessed through a secondary login established years ago, mostly for tax purposes. The correlation was terrifyingly consistent. Every absence was preceded, or immediately followed, by a significant, though perfectly masked, asset maneuver. These weren't random withdrawals. They were surgical excisions designed to remain below the threshold that would trigger an automatic bank alert, yet cumulatively staggering. He wasn't just stealing. He was restructuring my financial landscape to starve me out slowly. The atmosphere intensified when I began cataloging the missing objects. It started subtly. The antique silver letter opener from the study, a gift from my grandmother. The small framed watercolor of the Mediterranean coast that always hung by the breakfast nook. 3 specific volumes of first edition poetry I kept shelved near the fireplace. Individually, they were trivial, easily dismissed as misplaced during a cleaning spree. But when I cross-referenced the insurance appraisals I'd made 6 months prior, the pattern became explicit. He wasn't targeting high-value items that would necessitate immediate reporting. He was liquidating the sentimental periphery, items whose disappearance would be attributed to carelessness, generating financial yield without raising alarm bells. He was stripping the memory out of the house, turning our home into a sterile liquidation zone. One Tuesday, while he was supposedly securing a deal in Chicago, a trip I knew was a lie because I'd tracked his phone's GPS to a local storage facility 40 miles away, I ventured into his locked home office. I had long ago memorized the rhythm of his safe combination, a childish pattern based on our anniversary and his mother's birthday, details he likely chose because they were emotionally charged for him, but easily broken by logic. The heavy door sighed open, revealing not stacks of bonds or legal files, but a decoy, The shelves were filled with organized, yet utterly irrelevant, business literature and outdated tax returns. He had anticipated my move. He knew I was looking, but beneath the main shelf, behind a row of weighty legal encyclopedias, my fingers brushed against a faint seam in the wood paneling. It was a secondary compartment, a narrow, bespoke hiding place built into the wall. My heart hammered, recognizing the cold, meticulous craft of a man who left nothing to chance. Inside, there was no jewelry or cash, only a single heavy manila envelope marked only with a faint typed code. I pulled out the contents and the air left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. It was a spreadsheet titled Phase 2, Equity Reallocation. The document detailed, line by line, the gradual sale of my shares in the family trust, the trust I had established years before our marriage, secured by an ironclad prenup. But the columns listed specific dates over the next 9 months, each corresponding to a transfer of funds into shell corporations I had never heard of, registered in jurisdictions notorious for opacity. This wasn't just theft. This was the systematic dismantling of the foundation of my net worth. The accompanying documents confirmed the worst fear. A series of notarized signatures, expertly forged, authorizing the sale. My signature. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The earlier thefts, the expensive leather, goods, the antique opener, were simply Noy's small sacrifices to distract from this monumental, calculated heist. He hadn't just intended to leave the marriage with a good settlement, he intended to dissolve me financially, ensuring that by the time I realized the depth of the betrayal, I would lack the resources to fight him effectively in court. He had spent years studying me, not as a wife, but as an asset to be exploited and then neutralized. I looked at the forged signature, a near-perfect replica of my looping M and sharp A, and understood the true meaning of the word operative. He was not an emotional partner who had grown distant. He was a trained infiltrator whose primary mission was extraction. The marriage was the camouflage. My survival was no longer dependent on proving his infidelity or even his theft of physical goods. It was dependent on exposing a sophisticated, long-term pattern of corporate fraud and identity theft. The scale of the crime made the intimacy of our past life feel like a grotesque, elaborate stage play. I carefully photographed every page, placed the documents back exactly as they were, and closed the hidden panel, feeling the cold weight of the evidence settle deep within my core. He hadn't just dug a hole, he had engineered a financial sinkhole designed to swallow me whole. I was now standing at the very edge of the abyss, and the only way out was to push back with equal ruthlessness. The sheer impossibility of the situation demanded an immediate clinical response. The first step was insulation. By noon the next day, operating under the guise of an overdue dental appointment, I was seated across from Ms. Chen, a sharp, unsmiling corporate litigation attorney recommended by an old colleague. Laying the photographic evidence across her immense mahogany desk, I watched her expression shift from professional detachment to grave concern. She confirmed my worst fears. The documents were templates for transferring all joint liquid assets into a complex web of Cayman Island trusts designed to make recovery virtually impossible, even with a successful divorce filing. "He hasn't just stolen from you," Ms. Chen stated, tapping a section detailing power of attorney clauses. "He's legally quarantined your assets. We need leverage and we need time, which, based on this timeline, you don't have much of." The confirmation that the money was functionally gone didn't sting as much as the chilling realization that my meticulous planning, my careful savings over 2 decades, had been reduced to an academic footnote in his ledger of deceit. The tension at home became a physical entity, a thick, suffocating air that made breathing around him feel like swallowing sand. He was oblivious, or perhaps masterful in his performance. That evening, he brought home my favorite expensive Bordeaux and insisted on cooking, his hands resting affectionately on my shoulders as I washed lettuce for the salad. The touch felt reptilian. I found myself focusing on the minutiae, the exact placement of silverware, the tone of his forced, cheerful inquiries about my day. Anything to prevent the image of the hidden panel and the fraudulent signatures from breaking through the fragile shield of my composure. Silence, I discovered, was not merely the absence of sound. It was the calculated deployment of normalcy, a weapon I wielded as effectively as he did, each polite smile a deliberate lie I offered up to the man sleeping 3 feet away who was systematically dismantling my future. I knew he worked late on Fridays. It was his reliable pattern, a predictable habit I now exploited. While he was allegedly finalizing a major merger downtown, I slipped into his study, the room now tainted by the stench of betrayal. Ms. Chen's initial assessment had fixated on the trust paperwork, but I had a nagging suspicion about the schedule. I retrieved the macro lens camera I had used the previous night and began digitally magnifying sections of the photographed documents. Hidden, among the dense legal jargon, formatted almost like a footnote, was a sequence of initials followed by a date. FTC, due 2204. FTC meant Final Transfer Confirmation. Today was the second, 3 weeks. The time window wasn't just short, it was a deadline for total financial obliteration. This wasn't theft committed out of desperation, it was a calculated high-speed execution. The 3-week countdown galvanized my urgency. The sheer complexity of the shell companies suggested he hadn't worked alone. Using the administrative access code I'd memorized years ago, a sentimental date he never bothered to change, I synced his encrypted work phone to an old, unused laptop kept in the guest room closet. I wasn't looking for proof of infidelity, I was looking for collaborators. It took hours, sifting through thousands of heavily encrypted messages disguised as trading chatter. Then I found them. A series of communications marked Priority Alpha exchanged with an external contact named MV. My stomach dropped out completely, leaving an echoing vacuum in my chest. MV was Marcus Vance, not just a casual acquaintance, but my father's most trusted protege. The man who had delivered the eulogy at my father's funeral and whom I had appointed as the non-executive trustee overseeing the management of my family inheritance portfolio, the man sworn to protect me. The betrayal was now oceanic in scale. Marcus had been my financial lifeline since Dad passed, the one person I believed was operating entirely outside the domestic toxicity. Reading their emails confirmed a collusion that stretched back almost a year. A carefully choreographed dance, where Marcus, using his internal access, had systematically undervalued my holdings, making them easier for my husband to sweep into his offshore net without alerting regulatory bodies. The conversations weren't just about money, they were laced with a venomous disdain for my lack of financial acumen. The latest thread, dated yesterday, discussed the final devastating move: securing a court order to force the immediate sale of the Longwood estate, the ancestral property I inherited from my mother, the one piece of real estate I had explicitly kept out of any joint accounts. They planned to use a manufactured emergency liquidity crisis clause triggered by Marcus to liquidate the property before the April 22nd deadline. The Longwood estate was not just property, it was the last tangible anchor to my past, a place steeped in memories, the physical embodiment of my lineage. Selling it was not a financial necessity. It was an act of pure, calculated cruelty, designed to erase every shred of my independent identity. My hands shook so violently I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself, but the emotional chaos quickly crystallized into something cold and terrifyingly focused. They thought they had trapped me in a legal maze, betting on my sentimental paralysis and financial ignorance. They underestimated the destructive fury of a woman cornered, watching her entire world systemically dismantled by the people she trusted most. I closed the laptop, the screen reflecting the hollow, determined stare of someone who had just finalized a death warrant, theirs or maybe mine. The time for documentation was over. The time for strategic warfare, striking directly at the vulnerable underbelly of their arrogance and inflated egos, had arrived. I needed to move faster and dirtier than they could possibly anticipate. The silence in the apartment was a heavy, suffocating thing, far louder than any argument we'd ever had. They were circling, I knew it. They had shifted from the casual cruelty of omission to the strained caution of the guilty waiting for the hammer to drop. My immediate move was quiet, surgical. Using the backdoor access I'd built into the corporate network years ago, a little digital insurance policy they had long forgotten, I slipped past their new, heavily encrypted firewalls during the dead hours when server activity was lowest. My target wasn't the main data stream, it was the archival system, the place where they dumped the inconvenient truths, hoping the digital dust would settle fast enough. I found the first sliver of evidence nestled deep within a folder labeled Q4 Projections, Legacy Assets. It wasn't a projection at all. It was a formal, internal memo drafted by Michael, discussing the expedited dissolution of partnership structure and clearly referencing a crucial board meeting held 3 weeks prior, a meeting I had explicitly been told was postponed due to scheduling conflicts. The memo detailed the revised voting shares, meticulously reallocating my long-held equity among the three of them, valuing my contribution at a fraction of its true worth based on fabricated performance metrics. The cold corporate language was a punch to the gut. They hadn't just planned to exclude me. They had calculated the exact price of my erasure, right down to the decimal point. The document was signed, approved, and stamped "Confidential Execution Imminent." I didn't react instantly. I simply forwarded the entire folder to a secure offshore server, the transaction invisible and untraceable. I felt the slow burn of ice replacing blood in my veins. This wasn't professional disagreement. This was grand larceny masked by a handshake. The atmosphere in the office the next morning was nauseatingly polite. They avoided my gaze, replacing their usual aggressive dismissiveness with an almost theatrical concern. Sarah asked if I was feeling well, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, while Michael offered to take over my biggest client just to give me a break. Their forced empathy was a clear, tactical maneuver. They were testing the waters, trying to gauge if I had seen the memo or if I was merely suffering from stress. I played the role of the tired, slightly bewildered partner, nodding vaguely, allowing them the false comfort that their scheme remained perfectly hidden behind their impenetrable egos. Their silence was not acceptance of defeat. It was the arrogant confidence that they had already won. I knew I needed proof of their personal malice, something that tied their professional betrayal directly to the foundations of my life. Michael had always been obsessed with the old family property, the sprawling estate that legally belonged to the trust established by my grandmother. While they handled the business, I handled the trust administration. That evening, instead of hacking into the network, I focused on Michael's personal digital footprint, knowing his administrative passwords were notoriously weak and often linked to outdated, sentimental dates. It took less than an hour to find what I was looking for, buried beneath layers of encrypted legal documentation in his private vault. Discovery 2 was a set of preliminary deeds and legal opinions concerning the repurposing of the estate. Not only were they trying to seize the business, they were actively trying to liquidate my personal sanctuary, the one piece of tangible history I had fought tooth and nail to protect. But worse than the liquidation plan itself was the accompanying correspondence with a high-profile developer. A rival developer I had personally blocked them from working with for ethical reasons years ago. The letters revealed that Michael wasn't just planning to sell the property. He was negotiating to turn the land into a massive commercial complex, fundamentally destroying the environmental integrity of the surrounding area, purely out of spite because I had called him out on his unethical practices in the past. It was a scorched earth policy directed solely at erasing my influence, my principles, and my past. The motive wasn't just money, it was the absolute total annihilation of everything I stood for. The discovery hit me with physical force, stealing the breath from my lungs. The paper trail confirmed a level of sustained, venomous hatred I hadn't even grasped during the initial documentation. They weren't just embezzling partners, they were sociopaths systematically dismantling the architecture of my existence for sport. The realization didn't bring anger, it brought a terrifying clarity. They had moved beyond business and crossed irrevocably into personal war. The gloves weren't just off, they were shredded. There was no negotiation left, only retribution. The death warrant I had drafted in my mind needed immediate execution. and I now held the blueprint for the demolition of their entire, carefully constructed empire. My next move wouldn't be subtle, it would be catastrophic. The blueprint was not theoretical, it demanded execution. I cleared the desk, not of papers, but of hesitation, replacing the mess of frustration with the cold geometry of the necessary steps. The system they had used to monitor me, the one I had painstakingly reverse-engineered, became the perfect backdoor into their own highly restricted operational server. I spent the next 3 hours sequestered in the bunker, not sleeping, not eating, but surgically peeling back layers of proprietary firewall encryption. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the silence of absolute focus. This wasn't hacking, it was digital archaeology, digging through the sediment of their deceit until I hit bedrock. I was searching for the unvarnished truth of the conspiracy. The hard files that proved the initial attack on my company was merely the prelude to an attempt at permanent erasure. My target was a secure partition known only as Project Chimera, rumored to hold the truly toxic assets and shadow finances of their subsidiary networks. When the final decryption key cycled, a process that took 45 excruciating minutes, during which my breath caught tight in my chest, the access window finally flashed green. Inside, the file structure was complex, layered, and deliberately obfuscated, but one folder, labeled with an innocuous string of alphanumeric code, held a single, massive, compressed file. It wasn't the size that registered. It was the date stamp. 3 days before they initiated the hostile takeover attempt. They hadn't reacted to my actions. They had pre-planned the entire destruction of my life. Downloading the file was a risk, a digital thumbprint left on their most sensitive data infrastructure, but the necessity outweighed the caution. It took 17 minutes for the 40-gigabyte file to transfer. While the progress bar crawled, I monitored the network traffic for anomalies, expecting alarms to blare, but their monitoring system was primitive, designed to catch external threats, not internal surgical strikes. The moment the transfer completed, I didn't just delete the logs, I overwrote the entire server partition with a recursive, non-recoverable data wipe, erasing the history of my presence and, critically, eliminating the original location of their most damaging secrets. The file unpacked, revealing not just spreadsheets but a meticulously kept digital ledger, complete with audio recordings, internal memoranda, and, most damningly, a video conference transcript. The transcript detailed a private meeting between the CEO and his 2 most trusted legal counsel, discussing the surgical dismantling of the opposition. It laid bare the timeline, the shell companies established for asset hiding, the deliberate character assassinations planned for my executive team, and the final catastrophic financial move designed to leave me personally bankrupt and criminally liable for their manufactured failures. It wasn't merely business rivalry. It was structural, premeditated malice, designed not just to win but to extinguish. My focus zoomed in on a specific entry in the financial ledger, a 6-figure wire transfer labeled Initial Retainer Personal Services. This entry corresponded precisely with the dates surrounding my ex-wife's sudden aggressive filing for divorce, demanding terms that were financially impossible and professionally crippling. They hadn't just attacked my business, they had weaponized my personal life, funding the legal scorched earth policy against me. That detail, the monetary proof that they had paid for the destruction of my marriage as a distraction, was the true point of no return. It moved the conflict out of the realm of strategy and into the realm of existential threat. There was no longer any capacity for forgiveness, compromise, or even calculated retreat. The dawn clarity hardened into a brittle, terrifying calm. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor illuminating the room, the evidence of their total corruption glowing before me. This wasn't a smoking gun, it was a nuclear device, fully armed. My original plan for retribution felt insufficient, too reliant on established legal channels. Their tentacles ran too deep into the regulatory bodies. Justice, in this specific, poisoned context, could only be achieved through total unilateral destruction. I initiated the first sequence of the demolition protocol. It was a pre-scripted, highly protected program designed years ago for a theoretical worst-case scenario. This sequence didn't file a lawsuit. It deployed a series of timed untraceable data packets into key nodes of the global banking infrastructure. Packets containing only fragments of the proof, enough to trigger mandatory high-level internal investigations in 3 different continents simultaneously, focusing on potential money laundering and regulatory breaches related to Project Chimera. I wasn't asking for justice. I was triggering an audit they could never survive, guaranteeing the freezing of critical assets before they even knew the game had changed. The decision was made, sealed not with a signature, but with the press of the Enter key. The system confirmed the launch. The silence in the bunker afterward was profound, heavier than any sound. I looked at the screen, at the irrefutable evidence that confirmed their monstrous indifference, and felt a quiet, chilling satisfaction. They had sought to erase me. I would ensure that when the dust settled, their empire would be nothing more than a cautionary footnote in financial history. The demolition was underway, and I wouldn't stop until the last brick fell. The only emotion left was the cold, surgical focus required to manage the cascade of chaos I had just unleashed. The cold, surgical focus never wavered. The chaos I had unleashed was not a storm, it was a perfectly calculated implosion. I watched the live feeds, not the financial tickers, which were already a nightmare of red, but the internal security cameras of the executive wing. They were running. My father, the CEO, looked smaller than... I remembered his tailored suit rumpled, the air of invincible authority dissolving into panicked sweat as he shouted useless demands into a dead phone line. My mother, usually the picture of porcelain control, was weeping into the shoulder of the General Counsel, a man whose expertise in damage control was proving futile against the sheer, intentional scope of the breach. The structural failure wasn't just financial, it was existential. I hadn't merely sold stock. I had exposed the carefully concealed leverage, the unauthorized collateralization, the entire house of cards built on the unspoken rule that family loyalty would never allow a whistleblower within the gates. I was their blood, the one they sought to erase. And that fact was the one vulnerability they could not insure against. The realization, broadcast across every major news network, that the entire conglomerate was founded on, a sophisticated multi-decade shell game, was the real weapon. The call came precisely at 3:30 p.m., the moment the exchange officially halted trading on their primary stock, pending investigation. It was my father, his voice stripped raw, sounding like a desperate stranger. "You have to stop this, please," he rasped. "The regulators are here. The banks are pulling the lines. What do you want? Name your price. We'll give you back your shares. Your seat, everything." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, savoring the frantic desperation that replaced the casual dismissal he'd perfected years ago. This was the moment of justice, not the money. The money was just proof. "There is no price, Father," I said, my voice measured and steady, contrasting sharply with his hysteria. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Calmness was the ultimate power flex. "You tried to erase me from the history books, remember? You signed the papers, confirmed the narrative that I was incompetent, a liability, a non-entity. I simply acted on your assessment. Non-entities have nothing to lose, and therefore nothing to negotiate with." He paused, a horrified silence stretching across the connection as the weight of my words and the catastrophe they represented finally sank in. "We are family," he whispered, reverting to the useless shield of sentimentality. "No," I countered, a dry, cool finality in the word. "Family is supposed to be the safety net, the one unconditional source of protection. You proved family is just a liability to be managed, a potential threat to be neutralized when it becomes inconvenient. You taught me that lesson well, Father. I am merely applying the principle with a better execution plan." I hung up before he could respond, not out of malice, but because the conversation was finished. There was nothing more to gain from their suffering, only the tedious cleanup remaining. The following days were a blur of legal motions, emergency receiverships, and endless news cycles dissecting the betrayal from within. I watched the empire crumble not with triumph, but with a profound, aching emptiness. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own childhood. This was the consequence. The silence that Followed, the explosion was louder than any roar of victory. I was financially secure, legally protected, and utterly free, yet the freedom tasted sterile. I had proven my worth not by achieving their standards, but by fundamentally destroying the framework that allowed them to define worth. I learned the brutal truth that day, a truth forged in the heat of corporate warfare. Blood does not guarantee loyalty. In fact, proximity often guarantees the deepest cut. The most dangerous enemy is not the one you confront across a boardroom table, but the one who shares your surname and knows exactly where your heart is hidden. They didn't just reject me, they forced me to create a completely new self, one that was impenetrable, self-sufficient, and capable of enacting total demolition without flinching. The cost was the ability to trust, the willingness to be vulnerable, and the naive hope for reconciliation. That hope was the final, non-replaceable asset I sacrificed for my survival. I'm often asked now, years later, if I regret it. The destruction was absolute. The pain inflicted was precise and unforgiving. The answer is always the same. Regret is a luxury for those who had a choice. I was forced to choose between self-destruction and radical self-preservation. I chose to live, even if that meant burying the version of myself who believed in happy endings and unconditional love. The demolition is over. The dust has settled. I look at the wreckage, the collapsed towers, the scattered fortunes, the legacy reduced to cautionary tales, and feel only the quiet satisfaction of a debt settled in full. The silence is perfect. It is the sound of having nothing left to prove to anyone but myself. If you have ever felt that cold shock of recognition, the moment you realize the people who promise safety are sharpening the knife behind your back, then you understand the necessity of walking away, of rebuilding your identity brick by solitary brick. You know that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to ensure the foundation that sought to crush you falls first. It's not revenge, it's geometry. It's the required displacement of mass to create space for your own existence. And that is a battle you must win, alone.